Pittman arrived today wearing a gray tweed suit. As you will see in a moment, security was rather intense in his case, and he comes before us in a more colorful, if less covering outfit. I give you now, and you may have, Mr. Craig Pittman.
Thank you so much for that delightful and highly inaccurate introduction. My name is, let me start over. My name is Craig Pittman. I'm a reporter for the Tampa Bay Times, Florida's largest newspaper, or as we like to call it, Florida's least shrieking newspaper. I cover environmental issues for the paper, which to me is the greatest job in American journalism because, number one, they have to pay me to go out and ride around in a boat now and again. And number two, I get to cover some of the really wild, wacky stuff that goes on here in Florida, like pythons battling alligators for supremacy in the Everglades, or the captive breeding of endangered rats at the Lowry Park Zoo, which the taxpayers had to pay for. And by the way, somebody had to watch them, so if you ever think you have a bad job, just remember the poor guy who had to watch the rats breeding at the zoo. I've written several books. My last one, The Sin of Scandal, was about an orchid smuggling case that happened here in Florida. And I just mention it because it's not like any other book that's ever been published. If you look on the back, it says it's true crime / gardening. Which is, I always feel bad for the bookstore clerks trying to figure out where to put it. My current book is, the one I'm here to talk about today, is Oh, Florida, How America's Weirdest State Influences the Rest of the Country. I'm always a little fearful, or I'm not nervous, I guess is the right word, when I come to Tallahassee, partly because I drive up Appalachia Parkway and see something that's really hard to measure up to. Partly also because, everybody here has such very distinguished jobs, they're doing very important, serious work, but I have to tell you, this time, everybody's been really, really nice. In fact, when I first got to the hotel, I discovered I was being tagged. I had some people tagging along behind me, being very helpful, very solicitous. They said something about surveillance. I don't know what that was about. I guess that's some hot new club. Anyway, so let me tell you a little bit about the book and about Florida. Which way do I point this? It's set on stun, right? Not kill? Yes, okay, all right. Is it doing it right? Green button. And then what?
I might have broken.
Oh, there we go. All right. So the book is divided up into chapters according to subject. There's a chapter about what it's like to grow up in Florida. I'm a Florida native myself. My family got here in 1850, looking for a good deal on waterfront condos. There's a chapter about driving in Florida, of course. There's a chapter about gambling in Florida, which kind of goes with the driving, I guess. And so the last chapter, which sort of sums up everything, talks about how weirdness is everywhere you look in Florida if you know where to look for it. I illustrated that by talking about one day going to pick my kid up from school and then driving back home and all the things we pass along the way. In this very short drive, about 15 minutes, we passed by the home where the case of the naked nanny occurred. We passed by a building that was hit by a runaway blimp. We passed by the location where there used to be a pirate ship anchored that was used in both the SpongeBob SquarePants movie and a porn movie. And the city was pretty upset when they found out about the porn movie. And other oddities. And so then one day, after I finished writing the book, turning the manuscript, it's too late to make any changes, one day we're driving home and we pass by this woman who's up in a tree in downtown St. Petersburg. She's climbed into this banyan tree. She's got her blonde hair and dreadlocks. She's wearing this colorful Eastern European costume. And she somehow managed to drag an accordion up there in the tree with her. And she is playing and singing John Denver songs at the top of her lungs. And so I pointed her out to my son and I said, why do you think that lady with the dreadlocks and the colorful Eastern European costume and the accordion is playing and singing John Denver songs at the top of her lungs in that tree? And he said, it's Florida, Dad. Who knows? And I said, okay, all right, you got me there. I have friends who they tell me they're embarrassed by Florida, that they feel like we produce so much weird news that and I tell them, no, don't think of it that way. Think of it as this: we are the most interesting state. We have so many things that happen here that don't happen anywhere else, and we should be proud of that. For instance, we have more first magnitude springs in Florida than anywhere else in the world. First magnitude referring to how much water gushes out of them. In fact, that a pioneering biologist named William Bartram visited here in the 1700s, wrote very passionately about our springs, and it actually inspired Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem about Kubla Khan. We also have more fake dinosaurs in Florida than anywhere else. Many of them you can see at Dinosaur World, which is an attraction on I-4, not far away from the Holy Land experience, where they crucify Christ 6 days a week. The great thing about Dinosaur World, they have 199 dinosaurs. They used to have 200, but somebody stole one. We don't know how, we don't know why, but keep your eyes peeled with answers to the name of Rex. We have the nation's smallest police station. It's in Carabel, and it's a phone booth. And what I find interesting is they still have phone booths in Carabel. We also have the nation's smallest post office. It's in Okeechobee. It's a tool shed that's just big enough for the stamps to fit in. And I always like to mention the town of Sweetwater in Miami-Dade County, which was founded by a troop of Russian circus midgets whose bus broke down, and they figured this is as good a place as any to build their little tiny houses. Now, my friends who, like me, grew up in Florida, they say, oh, Florida didn't used to be weird. It only got weird when all those people moved down here from up north, right? And I have to tell them, no, we've always been kind of weird and crazy and mule-headed. Back when we were just a territory, we were actually known as a rogues' paradise. In fact, a visitor who came here in the 1830s said that he thought half the people who lived in Florida at that time were scalawags and robbers, and the other half were their penniless victims. So, not much has changed. The first flag that flew over Florida State Capitol in 1845 when we became a state actually said, "Let us alone," which you could take as either a wish or a warning. And of course, our first U.S. Senator, David Levy Yulee, told people he was descended from Moroccan royalty. He was actually just Jewish and didn't want people to know. His great accomplishment in office, by the way, he built the first statewide railroad system and then steered all the federal mail contracts to it. So, setting a very high bar for all the Florida politicians to follow after him. Now, the Florida pioneers knew some things that we seem to have forgotten in our modern day. One of the things that they knew was how hot it is here whenever the air conditioning doesn't work. That's why they named so many places in Florida after hell. We have Lake Helen Blazes, we have Tate's Hell Swamp, we have the Devil's Mill Hopper in Gainesville. Of course, a Florida man was the first one to invent a working air conditioning system. Dr. John Gorey of Apalachicola, trying to cool down his fevered patients, invented this system and got it patented to provide for cool air. He was such a great visionary, he of course was labeled a crackpot and died penniless. But there is a statue of him in Washington, so he's got that going for him. They also knew that the law kind of had limits as far as its reach in Florida, so often they did something illegal for a living. They would lure ships onto the rocks in order to strip them of whatever was valuable. They would poach valuable species. My favorite example comes from my hometown of Pensacola. Back in the days when the Navy had wooden ships, it bought vast acreages full of oak trees so that they would be sure to have enough lumber for building more ships. Well, people in Pensacola would sneak onto the Navy property and cut down the trees and haul them off for their own use. And the federal marshal in Pensacola at the time wrote a letter to his boss and said, "I can't make any arrests because half the grand jury's involved." They also knew that life here could seem totally random. Nobody lived at the beach back then. They figured if you couldn't plow it, that land wasn't worth having. But they would visit the beach from time to time to see what washed up on shore. And they would get, lumber, they'd find cookware, they'd find clothing, all sorts of things that they could use. At one point, over on the East Coast, a ship washed up that had 300 coconuts on board. And people who found it said, "What are we going to do with that?" Well, they planted it, and that's how Palm Beach got its name. Now, the other thing the pioneers knew that we seem to have forgotten is that Florida is constantly trying to kill us. We have more sinkholes here than any other place in America. We are the sinkhole capital of America. The one in the picture there happened in Mulberry at a phosphate processing plant. It was so big, people joke that it was the new Disney ride, Journey to the Center of the Earth. They had a second one happen there about 1.5 miles away a couple of years ago, so I guess they're going for frequent flyers on miles on that. We are the lightning capital in the Western Hemisphere. We have more lightning that hits here than anywhere else in this side of the globe. It's a beautiful summertime light show that we can all enjoy from indoors. But as a result, there's a professor at the University of Florida who has this great job. He studies the lightning on those stormy days. He goes outside when everybody else is going inside, and he shoots a rocket up into the sky with a copper wire trailing after it in order to attract the lightning so you can take pictures of it with high-speed cameras and measure it. If I was still 16, that to me would be the greatest job in America. You got rockets and lightning. We are the shark bite capital of the world. More people are bitten by sharks in Florida than anywhere else in the world, even Australia. I think because we taste so good, but that's just me. And we have the most hurricanes making landfall in the United States. We are the chin of the North American continent, sticks out of the Caribbean and says, "Hit me." And I always have to mention, too, we are considered among the most vulnerable places in the world to climate change because we are so flatter than Kansas over most of the state, and surrounded on 3 sides by water. So as the water comes up, it creeps much further inland here than anywhere else. And yet, in spite of these things, in spite of the sinkholes and the lightning, the shark bites, the hurricanes, the rising sea levels, and of course that creepy clown college in Sarasota, in spite of all those things, we call it paradise. And we tell people, come on down, come visit us, come bring your money. Now, a lot of the weird Florida stories that you see involve our sort of crazy critters that we have here in Florida. We have, I mentioned about the pythons. We have more invasive species that don't belong here, than any other state. The pythons, everybody knows about the pythons. Argentine tegus are the new thing. They're these kind of nasty tempered lizards that get to be about this big. I actually interviewed a guy in Tampa who one morning he was taking the garbage out and he just sensed something was following him. And he turned around and there was a tegu hissing at him. And it really freaked him out, so now his wife has to take out the garbage. My favorites are the giant African land snails that are all over Miami-Dade County and starting to spread in Broward. These are not the little snails you might be familiar with from your garden. These snails are as big as your hand. They eat 500 different types of fruits and vegetables. They will strip the stucco off the side of your house. They are hermaphroditic, so they don't need a mate in order to reproduce, and they reproduce a lot. And what I like about the snails, 2 things. One is the State Department of Agriculture is so freaked out by these things that it actually bought dogs and trained them to sniff out the snail mucus so they could track them down and kill them. So, other states may have their claims to fame, but we've got snail-sniffing dogs in Florida. Although I feel a little bad for the dogs. I think when they go back to the kennel at night, the other dogs are bragging, "Hey, I sniffed out some bombs today. How about you? Want to sniff out some drugs? How about you? Sniffed out some snail mucus." It's a living. The other thing I love about the snails, though, is their origin story. We have all these superheroes, supervillain movies now telling about their origins. The snails have a great origin story. They were smuggled into Florida by a religious cult that thought that drinking the mucus would make you healthy. Of course, it has the opposite effect. But what I particularly like is that one lady who's a member of the cult actually put several of these giant snails up under her dress and got on board a plane in Nigeria and flew to Miami that way. And I picture the guy sitting in the seat next to her, looking over and going, "Man, did you know your dress is slowly undulating back and forth?" We have a lot of people in Florida who own exotic wildlife. In fact, my neighbor, I live 5 minutes from downtown St. Petersburg, and one of my neighbors for the longest time owned 2 emus. Those big ostrich-looking birds that he kept in his backyard. And what was great was they would escape at least once a month. And we would see the emus running down the brick street, and then we'd see the neighbors chasing after them. One of my kids said that's his favorite childhood memory. He said all that was missing was the Benny Hill music. But in the same weekend, in 2013, some of you may remember this, there was a llama that got loose here in Tallahassee, and the Leon County Sheriff's Office had to taser it to capture it. Same weekend, a kangaroo got loose in Newport Richey, and the cops tried using tasers on it. It didn't work, and finally a guy who'd been a high school wrestler just tackled it. So, like I said, we're the most interesting state. And this is this produces a lot of stuff. We build our homes in what had been alligator habitat, bear habitat, panther habitat, and then we're surprised when those animals show up. Like, hey, we still live here. What are you doing here? We've got bears chilling in the hot tub or hanging out on the hammock. Panthers peeking through the sliding glass door or gobbling up the backyard chickens. The gators are my favorite, though. I've lost track of how many stories there are of people waking up at 4 in the morning because it sounds like somebody's knocking on the door and they peek out the window and it's actually an alligator slapping his tail up against the front porch. But what's great about the gators, number one, they're our first line of defense against the pythons. But number two, I know of at least 3 instances where alligators helped the police capture a suspect who was trying to flee. Talk about taking a bite out of crime. Now, Florida has many natural wonders that we should be very proud of. One of which is that we are the only state where the list of government jobs includes mermaid. If you're not familiar, there's a place called Weeki Wachee Springs, and bought in 1947 by an ex-Navy frogman named Newton Perry, who he built this underwater theater in the spring. He had air hoses all around and hired these nubile young women to pull on 60-pound prosthetic tails and swim around and wave to the tourists. And it worked really well up until about mid-2000 when business started to tail off. And so the state, rather than see this place closed, stepped in and bought it and turned it into a state park. So the mermaids now work for you, which has led to some interesting discussions about the use of tax dollars to pay for waterproof lipstick and shell balls. I always like to mention the first national wildlife refuge was in Florida. It was a place called Pelican Island over on the East Coast. There was a guy who lived on the next island over who was always fascinated by all the pelicans that would land there, hatch their young there, and so forth. And then he saw hunters showing up and started blasting away and killing the pelicans because at that time, this is early 1900s, the big fashion for ladies' hats was feathers from Florida birds. So they would come in and kill roseate spoonbills, great blue herons, and pelicans and take the feathers back to New York and use them for hats. At one point, a pound of feathers was actually worth as much as a pound of gold. And so this gentleman got very upset by this. He joined forces with a fledgling group called the Audubon Society, and they lobbied President Teddy Roosevelt to do something about it. He signed an executive order creating the Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge. It was such a great idea, it's caught on all over the country. There are now hundreds of national wildlife refuges, and other countries are starting their own wildlife refuges, copying the idea that started here in Florida. But of course, because this is Florida, this story has a Florida twist. The Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge needed a warden to run things, to help ward off the hunters, and so they hired the guy from the next island over. Hey, he's already there, right? Well, he served with distinction for 20 years, and then a hurricane came through, and the pelicans all left, and his boss said, well, I guess we don't need you anymore, you're fired. And then after he was gone, the pelicans came back. I always like to mention, too, that a Florida man co-wrote the Endangered Species Act. A guy named Nat Reed, some of you may remember Nat, he died earlier this year. Nat grew up in the Jupiter area, very in love with the natural wonders he saw around him. His mother said that he actually emerged from the womb with a fishing rod in his hand. So when Nat got a job with the Nixon administration in the Interior Department, he sat down at a Chinese restaurant with some like-minded friends, and in between Mugu Gaipan, they wrote out what became the Endangered Species Act and got it passed. And some of the animals on that original endangered list included the Florida panther, the manatee, the key deer, and the alligator. Yes, indeed, alligators used to be endangered. Now they're not. Now they're out there helping the cops. So that's a big success story. Of course, you may have noticed that Florida politicians contribute some of the weirdness that we write about. Speaking of, excuse me, I have to take a Marco Rubio break here for a second. We do field some really interesting folks. My favorite one, I think, is Sidney Katz, who was governor back around 1915. Sidney Katz, who always wore a pair of 6 guns on his hip and claimed that the Catholic Church was sending hitmen after him. And what I like is he would always end up his speeches by saying the Florida Cracker only has 3 friends: Jesus Christ, the Sears Roebuck, and Sidney J. Katz. And what I like about Governor Katz is he was not a professional politician. He was a Baptist minister, and but there was a Baptist convention here in Tallahassee, and so Reverend Katz made his journey to the city along with people from all over the state. The good people of Tallahassee threw open their homes and offered their hospitality. Reverend Katz got to stay in the governor's mansion. And so the whole week he was there, he was asking all kinds of questions about the place. Finally, on the last day, he asked the question most foremost in his mind, which was, how much do you pay in rent? And the governor then, Park Trammell, said, I'm proud to say that thanks to the good people of Florida, I live here rent-free. And Reverend Katz said, really? 3 weeks later, he filed a run for governor. And I always have to mention, too, that we're fairly, we recently voted to give felons back the right to vote. Well, Florida's always been very, very lenient with people who have committed violent crimes. We actually elected in the 1930s a guy named Fred Cohn as governor who had shot a man. Fred Cohn shot this guy for the crime of being a Republican. Fred Cohn, as a Democrat, felt like that was just, beyond the pale. And so it was the postmaster in White Springs. And so his relatives went to the postmaster, the wounded man, and said, listen, this would hurt Fred's future if you, pursued charges, and convinced him not to have Fred Cohn charged with a crime. And then when he agreed, then they prosecuted the postmaster for attempting to cover up a crime. But Fred, it didn't hurt Fred's future. He became governor. Have you guys ever been to Cedar Key? It's a lovely island community. I recommend you go visit. Cedar Key in 1890 was an island dictatorship. The mayor had hired a thug as his town marshal, and the two of them would walk around with sawed-off shotguns and order people to do random things for their own amusement. Hey, you two guys, headbutt each other. Ha, 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 and they'd walk off. Everybody was petrified. In fact, the New York Times did a story about the place and called it Cedar Key under a reign of terror. So this one woman, we don't know her name, unfortunately, she wrote to then President Benjamin Harrison and said, please help us. We need to get rid of these people. They're awful. And about that time, the mayor and his town marshal beat up the keeper of the customs house, who was a federal employee. So President Harrison sent a Navy cutter to Cedar Key to arrest the mayor, making it the only city in America that has undergone a military coup. Why they don't have an annual Reign of Terror festival to celebrate this, I don't know. I think it would be huge. They could reenact the landing, have the mayor be chased down the main street while people pelt him with popcorn. I think it would be big. It'd be bigger than Gasparilla. Oh yes, and I don't want you to think this is all stuff that happened in the long ago past and doesn't happen anymore. And in 2016, in the U.S. Senate race, we had a candidate who actually confessed that he had sacrificed a goat and drank its blood. And when I asked him what the blood tasted like, he said, fame. And that was a libertarian candidate. One of the Democratic candidates for that post was a gentleman who had accused his own wife of committing bigamy. And when she was on trial for that, it had to be postponed because one of her breast implants sprung a leak. This is not a story you would read anywhere else but Florida. I mentioned about driving up Appalachian Parkway. I'm sure you guys are all very, very proud of the fact that the Florida State Capitol won a prize. It won an online poll as the most phallic public building in America. I'm told by people who were there that, number one, there were no women on the design committee. And number two, that the very distinguished architect, Edward Durrell Stone, had submitted a different design, and the Florida officials in charge of the project rejected it, so perhaps this was his response. A bird dipped in concrete. Florida, I mentioned about Florida being influential. There was a Florida man who was involved in the conspiracy to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. He, of course, botched his job and got caught. Florida, nobody from Florida has ever been elected president. I think there's a part-timer, you guys may have heard of him, kind of obscure guy, his name's Trump. But more often, Florida has been a block to presidential ambitions, presidential hopes. I mentioned the Lincoln conspiracy. Of course, the Watergate burglars were from Miami. Again, botched their job, got caught. We won't talk about the recount. I know that's a sore subject for people. And I also know that there are some folks who swore they will never name their children Chad as a result. But to me, the best example of all is 1987. Gary Hart, Colorado senator, is the leading candidate for the Democratic nomination. There are rumors that he's cheating on his wife, so he tells reporters, follow me around, you'll find me a boring guy. And what he didn't know is the Miami Herald already had reporters following him around because they'd heard rumors that he was having an affair with this actress named Donna Rice. And sure enough, they caught Ms. Rice coming out of the place. But he attempted to hang on to the candidacy, and ultimately, though, he ended up having to drop out. But what I find interesting about this story is it wasn't just one Florida newspaper that hurt his presidential ambitions. After the Herald managed to end his candidacy, another one came up with a photograph. And the photograph showed that Senator Hart was sitting on a dock in Miami next to a party boat. He had Ms. Rice sitting in his lap, both of them with big smiles on their faces. Senator Hart's wearing a shirt from one of the crew members on board the boat, and the name of the boat and the name on the shirt was The Monkey Business. And that guaranteed he would never run for any office ever again. But what I like about that story is the other Florida paper that got the picture was the National Enquirer, which at the time was based here in Florida, based in Lantana. It was run by a guy named Generoso Pope Jr., who, when we talk about someone having a godfather, his godfather was literally the Godfather, Frank Costello, the Godfather of New York, floated him a loan to buy the newspaper. Generoso Pope Jr. had previously worked for the CIA in psychological operations. So if you're in the supermarket checkout and you're looking at the National Enquirer and you wonder, is that a CIA operation? Well, maybe it is. But what I love about Generoso Pope Jr. is that he pulled off the greatest recycling project in American history. He very thrifty guy. He's one of those guys who would squeeze a penny until Lincoln screamed. And so at a time when all of America's publishers were switching from black and white presses to color, most of them were just junking the black and white presses, but not Mr. Pope. No. Mr. Pope used it to start a new newspaper, the Weekly World News, where the facts never got in the way of a good story. The Weekly World News is a paper that told us that Elvis was still alive, that there was a bat boy living in a cave in Kentucky, and that space aliens were coming down here to make endorsements in the presidential race. My favorite headline from them, of course, is Half Human, Half Fish Found in Florida, or as I like to call it, that's your sneak peek at Channing Tatum's costume for the Splash remake. There is a somewhat more serious paper with roots in Florida, a guy named Alan Newhart, the Gannett Company executive. He saw the burgeoning population in Brevard County from the space program and convinced his bosses they should start a daily newspaper there called Florida Today. And it was different from any other paper at the time. Everything was in color, including the comics. All the stories were very short and jazzy. There were these odd lists that didn't have any connection to anything else. And it worked so well that Newhart wound up being promoted to CEO. People said he was such a sharp businessman that when he put on his sharkskin suit, you couldn't tell where Al left off and the shark started. And he used Florida Today as a template to create USA Today. So whenever you look at USA Today, you're looking at a product of Florida just as much as when you look at a crate of oranges. Now, there is a chapter of the book that you wouldn't want to read at a Sunday school picnic. It's called The Sunshine State. But I had to include it because promoters in Florida have been using sex to sell real estate to the Yankees for years. It started with a guy named Carl Fisher who dug up the bottom of Biscayne Bay and dumped it onto a mangrove island and called it Miami Beach. He would pay these women to wear what were then considered skimpy bathing suits, and he would pose them on the beach in February and take pictures of them and send the pictures to the newspapers up north, which of course would run these cheesecake photos, and people would say, wow, it's really hot in Florida, and some people would say, wow, it's really hot in Florida, and it would attract people down here. The city of St. Petersburg actually did him one better. Their PR person created, made up a Housewives Purity League that complained to the mayor officially about all the scantily clad women on the beach. They called them sea-bamps. So there are all these great headlines in papers up in Pittsburgh and places in the 1920s. Sea-bamps are stealing our husbands, say Florida women. So the next time you're at the beach, keep an eye out for those sea-bamps. The iconic pinup model Betty Page, that's her in the picture there, she was made famous by a Florida photographer named Bunny Yeager. Bunny had been a pinup model herself and figured out she could make more money behind the camera than in front of it. Part of her expertise was that she made the costumes for the pictures as well. That's her in the picture too. Deep Throat, the most famous X-rated film ever, was filmed here in Florida, financed by the mafia. They definitely made their money back on that one. And of course, because of our generally warm weather, we have more nudist resorts in Florida than anywhere else. We have every kind of nudist resort you can think of. We have the high-end, expensive ones, Although, since nobody's wearing clothes, I don't know how you tell that it's high and expensive. And then at the other end, you have one run by a group called the Bare Buns Biker Club, which frankly just sounds like a bad idea. The word shaking comes to mind. But they do produce an awful lot of the weird news we get to report. As Hurricane Irma was threatening the state, one of my jobs was to call around the places and ask, are you accepting refugees? And I called up one of the nudist resorts in our area, the Caliente Resort, and said, are you accepting hurricane evacuees? And they said yes, and the good news is you don't have to pack any clothes either. Now, of course, where you have sin, you have to have salvation. We have our own brand of religion here in Florida. We've got the famous Christ of the Abyss statue underwater in the Keys, in case you feel like worshiping while you're scuba diving or snorkeling. The little town of Inglis in 2001 banned Satan from their town. The mayor wrote out a proclamation, had it posted on the four corners of the city limits. Somehow it did not keep out all the reporters who came to write stories about it. In Miami, there are people who practice what's known as Santeria, which is sort of a blend of voodoo and Catholicism. And so when you have a friend who is going up in front of the court on charges, it's not uncommon to make an animal sacrifice on the courthouse steps in order to try and guarantee a good outcome, which means that the janitors have formed what they call the voodoo squad to go out every morning and clean up all the headless chickens outside the courthouse. Again, not a story you would see in any other state but Florida. You may recall the televangelist Jim Baker. He and his wife Tammy Faye had a multi-million-dollar operation in the Carolinas. They made so much money that Tammy Faye's dog had an air-conditioned doghouse. And Jim Baker threw it all away for a rendezvous with a church secretary in Clearwater Beach at the Sheraton Sand Key Resort, and the whole thing crumbled. What I always found interesting was that what happened afterwards, where people bombarded the Sheraton Sand Key Resort with requests to buy the sheets, the pillowcases, the towels, the shower curtain. Radio DJs wanted to broadcast from there. I think this is one of those instances where the rest of the world went crazy and Florida went, what's wrong with you people? And I have to mention, too, that the most famous pastor ever produced by America, Martin Luther King Jr., was arrested in 3 places in the United States, and one of them was in Florida. It was in St. Augustine. He was leading protests that eventually led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, banning segregation in public places. And he was arrested. He was trying to enter a motel restaurant in order to order a meal. And they wouldn't let him in. They stopped him at the door. They said, you can't come in here. This is whites only. And he said, you have to let me in. I'm an American citizen. And they said, no. And then they called the police, and he was arrested on the steps of the motel restaurant. And because this is Florida, this has a Florida ending to the story. Fast forward about 25 years, and the Hilton Corporation came in to buy the motel. They were going to build a Hilton there. They wanted to tear it down. Of course, all the historic preservation people went nuts. They said, you can't tear that place down. That's where Martin Luther King Jr. got arrested. Lawsuits galore ensued, lots of negotiations and mediation, and ultimately they came up with a very, very Florida solution, which is the Hilton Corporation was allowed to tear down the motel and the restaurant, but they saved the steps. So when you go to St. Augustine, you, like Martin Luther King, can stand on the steps where he was arrested, but like him, you can't go into the restaurant because it's not there anymore. Now, speaking of arrests, of course, lots of our Florida men and Florida women get arrested and make news. We do have really the craziest crooks anywhere. Last November, I actually interviewed a lady in the Villages, the big retirement community, who had been arrested for shoplifting while dressed as a turkey. And when I said, why are you dressed as a turkey, ma'am? She said, because it's Thanksgiving. Like, of course, everybody dresses up as a turkey for that. She said she was going to wear the outfit to court. I really hope she followed up on that. The TV show Cops was first filmed here in Florida in Broward County. I think that's why it became such a big hit, is people watching on TV went, that can't be real. and so even the TV song, even their theme song, Bad Boys, became a hit. Our concealed weapons law and our stand your ground law were the first of their kind in the nation. Have been copied over and over again by other states for good or for ill. And I always have to mention the crooked Miami Beach cops who changed America. 2 cops who would walk their beat by day. They would go back at night and rob the same businesses they were supposed to protect. One would stand on the sidewalk outside with a walkie-talkie and keep lookout while the other guy went inside and rifled through the cash register. Well, one night there was a ham radio operator who lived in the area who couldn't sleep. And so he turned on his radio and accidentally picked up their walkie-talkie discussions, realized what he was hearing, got a tape recorder and taped what they were saying, and it found its way into the hands of the police. Well, of course, the police listened to the tape and go, wait, we know those guys. That's Bert and Ernie. So they went and arrested these guys. They were put on trial, convicted pretty easily because of all the evidence against them. But their lawyer appealed the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and his argument was they could not get a fair trial because there had been a TV camera in the courtroom at the time. Florida was at that time doing a one-year trial of allowing cameras in the court to see how it would work out. And he argued that that TV camera had prejudiced the jury and guaranteed that the verdict was totally bogus. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled, no, it's okay to have TV cameras in state courtrooms, and so that's why we now have TV cameras all over in courtrooms across America. That's why you could watch the O.J. trial, Casey Anthony, etc., gavel, all because of two crooked Florida cops and a ham radio operator who could not sleep. That is a Florida story. Now, I mentioned one of the chapters is about driving in Florida. We are generally ranked as having the worst drivers in America, but I think it's because we have all the drivers in America. Many of them all on I-4 at the same time. And, you know, we have so many folks who come here from other places and they bring them within their culture and their procedures. And so you've got people in Florida who, you know, they will stop for anything, and some people who won't stop for anything. We've got people who put on their turn signal and go for 3 miles and turn the opposite direction. And we've got other people who wouldn't use their turn signal if you held a gun to their head. And so, of course, you know, there are going to be conflicts. In fact, I think that's why we have so many great road rage stories in Florida. My favorite one was the headline in the Gainesville Sun that said, "Man in road rage incident runs over self." But also, in 2012, we had so many people who crashed their cars into post offices in Florida that the Postal Service actually ran ads that said, "Please stop. We don't need a drive-through. We're good. Thank you." But Florida's need for speed is what led to the creation of NASCAR in 1947. A guy named Bill France Jr., who got together with a bunch of his fellow drivers, and they, over the course of 3 days, drew up the plans and the rules for NASCAR. Because it's a Florida, you know, now it's a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, but because it's a Florida-based sport, it's not like any other major league sport. You know, Major League Baseball, football, they have the owners get a commissioner and he runs things. No, NASCAR is still a family enterprise. It's run by the France family. So, you know, we always do things our own way in Florida. There we go. And now, people ask me, what's the ultimate Florida weird story? And I have to tell them, I don't think there is one yet. We haven't quite hit that combination of, you know, naked people, meth lab, machete, python, you know, where you go bingo. But I think that there are some, if we had a weird Florida Hall of Fame, it would go in on the first ballot. One is the gentleman who entered a contest run by a pet store in Fernandina Beach, where the first prize was a python, and in order to win, you had to be the one to eat the most live cockroaches. And it's a classic good news, bad news story. The good news is he won. The bad news is he died. And the medical examiner found that he had choked to death on insect parts, which just made me wonder, how often do you check that box on the ME's form? A classic one from 1930 from Key West. There was a guy there who claimed that he was a European count. He was actually more of a Noah count. He was working as an x-ray technician, and he fell in love with one of his patients, the beautiful Maria. And his love for her transcended death, by which I mean he dug up the body after she died and lived with it for 9 years. And when her sister found out, she, of course, was horrified, reported him to the authorities. They arrested him. He was put on trial for desecrating a grave, but he was acquitted because the statute of limitations had run out. One of my all-time favorites, though, concerns the lady in the picture there. She was known as the Naughty Nympho case. Her name's Kathy Willis. She was, shall we say, entertaining customers at home for pay. And what the customers didn't know was that her husband was in the closet with a video camera and a big yellow legal pad on which he was making notes about what the customers liked and didn't like. He thought one of the customers was getting a little too chummy with her, and so he called the guy and left him an answering machine message threatening him. Well, the customer then went to the police. The police raided the place, and that's when they discovered that the guy in the closet wasn't Mr. Willits, it was Officer Willits. He was a police officer himself. And so then, when the news got out that there was a client list and several videotapes, a group of men who all called themselves John Doe, and I think there was 11 of them, so John Doe, John Doe, John Doe, John Doe, John Doe, John Doe, versus state of Florida, sued to keep the client list secret. And so some very enterprising people in Fort Lauderdale printed up T-shirts that said, "I'm not on the list," and they sold out in hours. The case went all the way to the Florida Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled that if you're doing something naughty, you have no expectation of privacy. So, of course, the client list became public, and as you might expect, it included the names of some prominent public officials who had opposed, say, dirty bookstores and things like that while still visiting Mrs. Willits. I don't want to tell you the whole story. There are lots of twists and turns. At one point, the Willitses claimed that this was marriage therapy for them. And apparently it worked because they're still together 20 years later. Tell that to your spouse when you get home. Now, I go into some detail in the book about why Florida produces so many weird stories. I'll give you the Al Newhart USA Today listicle version here, which is, we've undergone this wrenching demographic change here. In 1940, we were the least populated southern state. We're now the third most populous state. We've got 21 million people here now. We passed New York in 2014. Plus, on top of that, we've got 100 million tourists who visit every year. And we're not evenly spread over the whole peninsula. Of course, we're all kind of crammed into that 30-mile wide swath along the coast or along I-4. So, of course, you bring together that many different people from that many different places. You're going to start, ramming into each other's cars and chasing each other with machetes and arguing over whose dog pooped on whose lawn. Plus, think about who these people are. We've got ex-CIA agents who fell in love with Florida while training for the Bay of Pigs invasion and came back here when they retired. We've got retired carnies in Gibsonton. We've got Hooters waitstaff, because the original Hooters was built in Clearwater. We've got professional python wranglers, monkey breeders, spam kings, strip club moguls, and 29 electoral votes in the electoral college. Our tropical climate means we're out doing weird stuff all year long. We're not cooped up inside because of snow. This was surprising. I actually called a machete distributor, and he said, yes, we sell more machetes in Florida than any other state, which blew my theory that they were giving them away at the state line with cups of orange juice. And I always have to mention, we are routinely ranked 49th among the states in funding for mental health treatment, which, all I can say is thank God for Texas. Like I said, some of my friends, they get embarrassed by Florida. When you live in Florida for a while, you learn to watch the news in a certain way. Every time there's a big story that breaks, you go, okay, what's the Florida angle? Because there is one. There's always a Florida angle. The big Major League Baseball doping scandal breaks. Yes, there's a Florida angle. The clinic was in Miami. The examples are many. Did you guys read the story or see the story about the woman in New Jersey who stopped from trying to board an airplane with her emotional support peacock? Yeah. The peacock was from Florida. But I tell my friends, don't be ashamed of Florida. Don't be upset and worried about that. You should be proud that we contribute that much to the American way of life. Because I contend that the same conditions that produce all those weird stories also spark our creativity and help us to influence the rest of the country. We laugh about all the Florida man stories. Florida man dials 911 because strip club won't let him bring in his cat. Yes, that's an actual headline. But also the list of Florida men includes John Adonassoff, the guy who invented the computer. He grew up in Polk County. His dad was a phosphate mining engineer, always carried a slide rule. Young John became fascinated by that. It ultimately led to him inventing that wonderful, wonderful machine that we use to play solitaire and watch cat videos. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, he grew up in Florida, started his first business here. If it had failed, would we have ever heard from him again? Would we now be dodging back boxes of books dropped on us by drones? Probably not. My favorite example, though, is the most popular author you've probably never heard of, Donald J. Sobel. Donald J. Sobel was a Florida man. He wrote all of the Encyclopedia Brown mysteries for kids. And if you read them carefully, you'll realize he set the books in a sort of an idealized Florida beach town. And what I always found fascinating was that he was writing these books while living in Miami in the 1980s during the whole cocaine cowboy era, which is about as far from the Encyclopedia Brown mysteries as you can get. So I picture him in the morning reading his morning Miami Herald and reading about drug dealers having shootouts on I-95, seeing headlines like drug dealers masquerading as cops, busted by cops masquerading as drug dealers, or seeing stories like, and this really happened, drug dealers in an airplane bringing in cocaine were being pursued by an airplane from the Coast Guard that had picked up on them. And so in order to lighten their load, the dealers threw out a bale of cocaine, and it tumbled end over end through the air and landed in Homestead in the middle of a crime watch meeting. And just missed hitting the chief of police in the head. And I picture him reading this stuff while he's eating breakfast and then folding up the newspaper and going to sit down at his typewriter and write another story about how a young encyclopedia helped his dad, the police chief, solve a bank robbery because of his knowledge of Civil War trivia. But that's life in Florida. That's the way we do things here. And the other argument I always make is, if you want to live where it's boring, where every day you see the same news day after day after day, go out to one of those square states out west. Go out to Nebraska or something. But if you want to live in a place where every day you open the paper or turn on the news and you go, wow, I punched a swan today, then you're in the right place. And you should be glad about that. You should be very proud of that. All right, let me mention one other thing. I do have an author newsletter I put out once a week called Oh Florida, the newsletter, where I count down the top 5 Oh Florida stories of the week. And as you might guess, it's really hard picking just 5. So I'll be outside signing books. If you're interested in signing up, give me your name and your email address, and I'll make sure you get a copy. Thanks again.